Hello friends, welcome to Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about the best bang for your buck amp I've ever bought in my life. I paid $200 for this 1984 Peavey Special 130 transistorized amp. And for me it was kind of a moment of eating crow because it kind of became really popular to kind of hate on Peavey and think of them as kind of a second class or second or even third tier amplifier. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my overcoming my own prejudices against Peavey. Going to talk about the Special 130, going to talk a little bit about the history of Peavey, also the context that, because I think that's so important. People need to understand the time period, what was going on with other manufacturers and what was going on in the marketplace in the mid 1980s. Yeah, so we're gonna have a good time. All right, but while you're thinking about it, if you haven't done it already and you've been enjoying the show, well, please go down in the corner and hit subscribe. If you've already done that, then I appreciate you supporting the show, and there's multiple ways. The best is Patreon, and so the link is down in the description. If you don't, there's also other options. So there's like there's tip jar information, or you can go to askzach.com and you can find merch like this It's a Sickness shirt, coffee mugs, all sorts of things. All right, let's dive in. So let's see. Let's talk about Peavey and my kind of experience with Peavey. So I grew up in Kingsville, Texas, which is way down south. The nearest big town is Corpus Christi, and when looking for guitars and amps as a young guitar player, I would go into Corpus Christi a lot, and the shop I went to the most was Clausen's Music, and it's still around to this day, and it's still of course run by the Clausen family, and they're great people. And at the time, Clausen's was a full line Peavey dealer, and that was really a very advantageous thing for both them and customers. Peavey was, in the 1980s, was really high on the hog. They were really making a killing. They had, of course, Hartley had spent a lot of time, kind of being on the forefront of transistorized technology, and had started making transistorized guitar amps in the late 1960s. And then he got into small PAs and bigger PAs. And so by the 1980s, Peavey was really killing it. They, if you were a Peavey dealer, you were selling lots of PAs, whether it was small ones or bigger ones, but most bands were using Peavey PA equipment. Then a lot of local bands were using Peavey backline, so they were using Peavey bass amps, some Peavey microphones, and Peavey guitar amps. Of course, if you were a steel player, you probably had a Nashville 400 or an older Session 400 amplifier. But Peavey was really king. And again, I would go down to Clausen's, and they had all sorts of Peavey amps. And I wanted a nice guitar amp because I had my first guitar amp was a Fender Sidekick Reverb 35. Okay. I think I got this amp in 1986 or 87. It was my first amp, and it was not great. And you have to remember what was going on during this time period. And one of the reasons why Peavey was doing so well was you had guys like Fender CBS had sold the company in 1985. They sold Fender. And the new owners, they couldn't afford to purchase all the factories and such. So they were basically buying old stock, existing stock, and they were buying the names, trademarks, legal assets and things of that sort. So, and they really couldn't set up amp manufacturing. So they had their amp line was mainly coming from overseas, and it was transistorized, and that's where you got like the Sidekick series and such. Then for tube amps, they were having them made by the Sun factory, and that's where you get the Red Knob Twin and the Red Knob Champ 12 and things like that. So Fender was not in a strong position as far as amplification. And that Sidekick Reverb 35 that I had, it was not a good amp. I mean, it worked and it functioned, but I mean, you couldn't play a gig with it. The overdrive circuit on it sounded awful. And I really wanted a better amp than that. So my dad and I made a deal. My dad wanted me to, do things besides playing the guitar, which, I mean, he loved me playing the guitar, but he told me if I did the off season of football, he'd buy me a guitar amp, whatever guitar amp of my choice. So the off season of football is basically where you work out and run through tires and things like that. And so I did that. I did a semester of that just to get a guitar amp. And so I tried out a bunch of different things, and I went down to Clausen's and I ended up buying a Stereo Chorus 400, which was kind of like the big brother to this Special 130, but yet it also had a nice stereo chorus circuit in it. And it was big and heavy, but it was loud and it sounded really good. And that was my first really, good professional stage-worthy guitar amp. And I used that playing in churches and playing street revivals and playing gigs, and it was a really good amp. Let's kind of get back into the manufacturer's context. So I already kind of told you about Fender. So Gibson, even though these weren't labeled Gibsons, they were, Norland owned Gibson at the time, and so Norland also owned Moog, and so you had the Lab Series amps. Well, Lab Series had done well in the late 70s and early 80s, and then they pulled the plug on them. So they're gone. Music Man, another company that done really well in the 70s, and then by 1984, they went out of business and they were sold to Ernie Ball, which of course they couldn't afford to, keep going with the amps, and so they started going with the basses and guitars first. So then that was another major competitor that was out of the way. So Peavey really had a wide open place right there, and they were way on the forefront of transistorized technology. And Hartley Peavey was always about making a good quality, affordable product, for working musicians. That's always what their mantra was. So they came out with the Special. Originally, it was called the Special, and then the little brother to it was the Bandit. So the Special was around 120 watts, and then they had the Bandit, which was around 60 watts. And then, a little bit later, they came out with the Special 130, a little bit more powerful, and they decided to include the wattage in the name. So the Special 130 was very much a response to what the market wanted at that point, which the really big popular amplifier at that time was the Mesa Boogie, Mark series. So that was considered the ultimate guitar to have, unless perhaps you were a hair metal guy and you had to have a Marshall amp, a big Marshall stack. But so many pros at this point were using Mesa Boogie. So you had everyone from Keith Richards, Lindsey Buckingham, Santana, on down the line. It was a very popular amp. So people wanted a small 100-watt 112 amp with a cast frame, nice speaker, and channel switching. They wanted to have overdrive capabilities in the amp. And that's what the Special 130 is. The Special 130 is kind of like it kind of is a transistorized boogie amp. So you have a Fender-ish clean sound, and then you have a distortion, channel. You have channel switching. I'm just going to say this now because this is one of the things that why I and other people had difficulty with Peavey amps in the 1980s was partially a user issue and just a lack of knowledge. One of the keys to making these sound more like you want them to sound, more like a clean Fender sound or kind of hopped up Fender sound, is knowing how to use the mid and shift knob. So there's a concentric knob here, and it's called mid shift. So the inner knob is mid control and the outer one is the shift control. So this is the key to making the amp sound less honky, less mid-rangey, because if you just set everything at noon on the clean channel, which I guess they share EQ, but it will sound pretty honky. So what you have to do is, so what I've done is the shift control, I have it up in the 6 range, and then the mid control, I have it cutting down to 3. Okay, so yeah. So what that does is it's just pulling back some of the mids so that it has more of a Fendery, clean sound versus a real super pokey mid-rangey sound. Yeah. So, this is a MDF cab. They're really easy to service. They're really easy to take apart. Yeah. And it just has, it has spring reverb. It has, a full complement of EQ controls. Then you have the, the distortion channel. So I'm just and the distortion channel, to me, if you use it at lower settings, it kind of has more of a tube screamery sound. So I'm going to mess around with this a little bit for you. Another tip is that to access both channels, you have to have the foot switch because there's no control on here to switch channels. So, I mean, you could have you could put a shorted out jack on the back to hold it in one position or the other, but you really need to have the nice plastic foot switch. So let's go over to the overdrive channel. Let's see how I have it set. So you can see that just has a little bit of hair. Kind of sounds like a tube screamer to me, on a lower setting. So as you jack this up, let's take the pre-gain up to about 5, and the saturation, we're going to take it all the way up to like 8 or so. So here you get still a manageable sound. It's not completely, saturated to heck, but yeah. And there's the reverb that I should have had on earlier. So let's go back over to the clean channel. And it just has a really, really nice sound. Let's see some other things about this. So yeah, let me tell you how I bought the amp. So of course I had this very negative viewpoint toward Peavey because it got to where after having the Stereo Course 400, I started getting some old Fender amps. And so I had a Brown Deluxe, and then I got a 1979 Silverface Twin that was not a better amp than that Stereo Course 400, but I thought it was because it said Fender. But I kind of went through this period of time where I really thought, Peavey was not good, and to be pro, you had to have an old Fender or a, maybe a Music Man amp or a whatever it was, but you didn't want to have a Peavey. There was one exception. I lived in France for a year. I lived in Paris in the year 1999, and while I was there, the only good amp that I could afford, again, this is key here, this is kind of the Peavey mantra, was a Peavey Classic 30. So the other amps that I could afford were kind of garbage. And the Classic 30 was a really good amp, and I could actually gig with that and use it. And it was a good amp, and I'd still have it if I hadn't have, of course, moved back to the States and, didn't want to ship a 220 amp, over here and then try to have it converted and such. So I sold it. Fast forward a number of years, and my buddy Austin, who you've seen in some of the episodes, in one of the live streams that I did, and I've talked about him. He's kind of a childhood friend of mine, and he lives here in gigs. He had invited me to go down and see a band play that was playing on Broadway here in Nashville, and it was a really great front man, singer, really funny guy, and he was playing a Tom Anderson Telecaster into a Special 130. And this was, traditional country band, pedal steel. They actually had Tommy White, the steel player from the Grand Ole Opry, was playing in this band, and they were just killing it. And he was just using a Special 130. The front man was, with this Tom Anderson Telly. And I started thinking, maybe Peavey's not so bad. But I still kind of threw it out the window. Then, would joke around about Peavey's all the time, about how they weren't any good and how they were, cheap amps or whatever. And then more recently, I was just kind of, scrolling on your phone, like we do. I think I was on Instagram or something, and they recommended a guy's account named Mike Lapinto, and I saw that he plays guitar with Chris Stapleton, and I was like, oh, okay. Let's see what this guy's got. And there were posts of him with like blackface amps and stuff, and maple cap neck Telecasters and stuff like that. But then he had a bunch of clips of, he had clips of him playing through 80s Peavey amps like Bandits and Special 130s. And you could see where he was finding these things out on the road while he was on tour. And he even had photos of him, playing, live, not with Chris, but in clubs here around Nashville, and he was using those 80s Peavey amps. So I started thinking, maybe I need to check this out. So I got online and I started looking at the amps, and the amps were, they were all pretty cheap. The Special 130 tended to be in the $100 to $300 range, with a lot of them being in that $175, $200 sweet spot. So, sometimes people that, original owners or stuff like that, they would want, a little higher, especially if they had like the cover and it was super clean. So I found this one on the old Craigslist, and the guy was here in town, but he was in one of the suburbs, kind of on the other side of Nashville. Well, I was kind of having a busy week. I had to film an interview at True Tone Lounge, and I had like my son had a wrestling tournament, and there was just a bunch of stuff going on. I really didn't have time to meet someone. And also, I don't know about you, but I kind of get freaked out about, buying an amp from somebody, and I don't want to just meet at a gas station parking lot or a Walmart or something like that. I want to be able to plug into it. And then I really don't want to go to someone's house. That kind of freaks me out. So usually what I've done over the last number of years is I ask people to come to True Tone's offices. And that's, of course, a safe place where there's other people there, and they can feel safe, I can feel safe. And so I asked the guy, he wanted $195 for this Special 130. And I told him, I said, well, would you meet me at True Tone's offices? And he said, well, that's kind of a haul for me. Tell you what, I'll do it if you tag on $15. And I was like, well, that's a no-brainer. That's a lot cheaper than any kind of shipping would be. If you were to, this is a 50-pound amp. So I said, absolutely. So for $210, he came down to True Tone's offices, and I checked it out. Amp was great. It had scratchy pots to it, but otherwise perfectly fine. I gave him the cash. He went on his way, and then I took about 30 minutes to clean this thing up. So it was really easy to take apart. It has chassis straps. The grill cloth is held in place by, some form of dual lock. Now, of course, underneath here, I found all sorts of dust bunnies and stuff. And so I used a light brush to get all the dust bunnies out, and I used some compressed air. I had Bill Keck, who's the one of the techs down at True Tone. I opened it up and I said, hey, will you check the electrolytics? Make sure that nothing needs to be replaced, off the bat. Any kind of maintenance needs to be pulled. And it was fine. And it's all original. There's no repairs or any modifications that's been done to the amp. And then used some deoxit on all the pots and moved them around, and all of them, unscratchified themselves. And so it was like $210, 30 minutes of labor of, cleaning it up with compressed air and deoxit on the pots, and all of a sudden I had a fully functional giggable amp. I couldn't believe it. And it was like I plugged into it and I heard the sounds and I was like, I mean, I do prefer my 1965 Deluxe Reverb or my old Vox amp, over it, but it's such a giggable, usable sound. I mean, there's nothing not to like about it. And it's $200. $200. Now, just to give you I always like doing this on any episode where I talk about gear. I like to talk about inflation and how much the amp costs new and such. So the Special 130 was $399 in the mid 1980s, which if you take inflation into account, that was about $1,050. 1050. Just to give you more context, a red knob twin made in the Sun factory at the same time would have been $999, which would have been $2,600. So this, is just showing how, what a great bang for the buck amp this was then, and even more so now. Also in my studies, I started realizing how many people, used Special 130s. Now, obviously there were a lot of country players that used them, and part of that has to do with geography. Peavey's in Meridian, Mississippi. So they're physically close to a lot of, country music and Southern music, as it were. And so that's why you have guys like Leonard Skinner using them, and also, Brent Mason. So Brent Mason used 2 Special 130s all throughout the 80s. So from his time with the Don Kelly Band up through even into the early 90s, he was still using a pair of Special 130s. So there's footage of him playing on the American Music Shop with the New Nashville Cats and Mark O'Connor. And he's playing his Silver Telly along with 2 Special 130s. And Chet Atkins. Chet Atkins used Special 130s for a while. And then he started using, of course, Music Man amps later in the 80s after the amps were, after the amps were no longer in production. All sorts of cats, used Peavey. And Steve Wariner. So Steve Wariner, used to play through 2 Blackface Twins, and he retired those in the mid 80s and used a pair of Special 130s with a TC chorus splitting the signal, and used that for a long period of time. Yeah. So these amps, really, they're real workhorses. And I just have to repeat this for impact. My old 1965 Deluxe Reverb, I have to, fix, tube rattles or a microphonic tube, or, maintenance has to be done on it on a yearly basis. This amp is almost 40 years old and it's never had anything done to it other than having the dust blown out and deoxit, shot into the pots and moved around. And again, $200. These are great amps. This is the best bang for your buck amp that's out there. I mean, if you're a kid, if you have a kid that's learning how to play guitar, for $200, you can get a piece of crap amp that can't compete with a drummer and that is not repairable, or you could get this amp, an 80s transistorized Peavey amp that, yes, they are heavy because of the MDF. So yes, they this is a 50-pound amp, so it's heavier than the Deluxe, but also it's 130 watts. It gets loud enough to get you fired. That's always the joke, It's like, yeah, it'll get loud enough to get you fired from almost any gig, and it will, So I mean, it's like today I've got it on under 2, and it does keep getting louder. So these are really great little amps, and I really had to eat crow and just say, yeah, that's good stuff. Hartley Peavey made a good amp. He makes good amps, and he did a good job, especially with the Special 130 and the Bandit 65. They're really my favorites of that era. And again, you can find them all over the place. They're on Reverb. They're on Guitar Center used. That you'll find them on, Craigslist or a Facebook Marketplace. Wherever you're looking, you're going to find them, and most of them are going to be in that $100 to $300 range. And the main thing you want to make sure is that it has the foot switch, and then you probably just need to blow it out with some compressed air. I will say the other thing is that the Scorpion speaker is a really good unit, and partially it's because it's a cast frame speaker. So this amp didn't have a cheap pressed frame speaker. It had a really nice high wattage speaker, and again, kudos to Hartley Peavey and the crew that designed these things. All right, well, I have to, we're going to edit this little part, and I'm going to grab my book for the book nook. I forgot to grab this. All right, now it's time for Zach's book nook. So since we were talking about Peavey, I thought it'd be appropriate to recommend this Peavey Guitars book. So this was written by Willie G. Mosley. And so if you're a reader of Vintage Guitar Magazine, especially over the last 30, 40 years, then you are well aware of Willie. He is probably one of the best writers for vintage, and he's written a number of guitar historical related books through the years. This has some really good autobiographical info on Hartley in the first part of the book, just kind of telling his story and how he grew up with a dad that had a music store, and just how he got into the business. It's really inspiring, and just the level of success that he had in his 20s and 30s. Just a ridiculous amount of success, starting a company from nothing. And then as he had trouble with suppliers, like he had trouble getting loudspeakers. So what did he do? He started making his own speakers. It's like, yeah. And then he was having, trouble with the competition from companies that made both guitars and amps. And so just to compete with them, he started making guitars. And so this book is really focused much more, it has a little bit about the amps and of course about Hartley's, kind of a little bit biography on him, but it's mainly about the Peavey guitars made through the years. And there were a lot of innovations and things that forward thinking on his part that other companies started doing later, like using CNC machines and just being taking inspiration from firearms company and the precision that they were using versus the primitive methods that other guitar makers like Fender and Gibson were using in the 60s and 70s. So great book. And if you're wanting to learn more about old Hartley Peavey. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.